Edouard, I'd like to start with the most fundamental question. What is consciousness?
Oh, this is probably the most difficult question you might start with. So it's important to, when one tries to answer this question, to draw distinctions. I feel if one does not start distinction between different things consciousness might well be, then the discussion would get muddled very quickly. And I have found that the discussions that Ned Block introduced now 30 years ago between access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness to be extremely helpful, even so it's not nearly as clear as one might want, maybe for the purpose of philosophy or science, it remains a very useful distinction. So access consciousness, as many of your listeners will know, just is the fact that we can get some information about the world and use that information for rational action, rational thinking, verbal report. Phenomenal consciousness is quite different. It's the idea that there's a special feel to maybe our perceptual experiences, right? The idea that to drink some soda, there's a feel of sugar that comes with it. To smell, I know it's fall here, so to smell the leaves which are a bit wet comes with a specific smell there. And that is experience, that phenomenal consciousness is meant to be capturing. The notion of phenomenal consciousness is meant to be capturing. So it really depends on what question you're asking. Are you talking about access consciousness or phenomenal consciousness?
I think it's great that you define those terms, because I think the main topic of this conversation in general does touch on phenomenal consciousness. I mean, that's the one that people seem to be most concerned with when they want to know that qualia, that qualitative subjective experience. What are your thoughts on that? I know I watched the podcast with you on Philip and Keith's show, and you guys were discussing, is this hard problem actually a problem? Let's
right.
go on that road.
Yeah, so that's right. So that's when people are really worried about consciousness, it's not access consciousness. And you're right, access consciousness, you might think, well, even a robot could have access consciousness. Let's build it the right way. Phenomenal consciousness, a little bit harder to see a robot having phenomenal consciousness. So it's really there that the action seems to be. So I have a very heterodox view about phenomenal consciousness. Let's say consciousness from now on. Many philosophers and many scientists believe it's a very difficult problem. In fact, the hardest problem in the universe to solve. I think people are mistaken. I think there is no such thing as phenomenal consciousness. I think it's an invention that philosophers have created. And of course, it came with a lot of metaphysical issues that we are still struggling and that scientists have inherited. So that's in a sense my very heterodox view on the matter. Phenomenal consciousness is a myth that does not really exist out there. And as a result, we need not try to worry. It's worth noting I'm not the only one with this kind of view, even so my view is distinct from some of my
One second, Edward, I seem to have a connection error here. Are you back? Sorry, 1 second. Are you back? Can you see me?
Yes, I can see you. Yes,
okay, cool. Sorry, I just reconnected to a different source just because I noticed there was a lag as well.
Okay, very good.
This one should work much better.
Yeah. So I was saying that in some of our views, Patricia Churchill has said similar things, and so has Dennett. Yes. However, their position is quite different from mine in interesting respect. They, at least in some of their writings, tend to view consciousness as an expression of a naive, folksy understanding of the mind. The things that scientists and philosophers have inherited, this folksy understanding of the mind. I think that's a mistake. I think the opposite is true. In fact, I think phenomenal consciousness is not really part of the way we grasp the world. People don't have specific views, lay people, people who haven't really thought about the matter, don't really have a theory about our relation to our own mind. Rather, they think we are in some ways in the world. We are always acting out there. It's rather philosophers and following them scientists who have, in a sense, projected our relation to the world onto our own mind. And then they start worrying about, well, what is these qualitative properties of the mind? And I think that switch from being embedded in the world, we always are experiencing the objects themselves, to we are experiencing something mental, came with the modern revolution, the scientific revolution, and the modern times. I think Descartes and the new wave of philosophies that followed Descartes is quite responsible in that respect for focusing philosophers' attention, and then in recent decades, scientists' attention onto the mind itself. So this is the way in which my take on the matter differs from, let's say, Pat Churchland's and Dan Dennett's take on the matter, at least as I understand them.
And so your work in the philosophy of cognitive science and science in general, from your work, what have you noticed, or what have you gathered over time that helps to solidify this view that you have?
Yeah, so a few things. So on the one hand, I'm a philosopher, and I've read quite a lot of history of philosophy, and I think it's really important to look at history of philosophy both in the Western world, but also in the non-Western world, in India, in China, and in all these other great philosophical traditions. If you look at the Western world in particular, it's quite striking that there is no such thing as phenomenal consciousness in ancient philosophy. So Greek philosophers are very much concerned with perception. They write a lot about perception. Some of them are worried about mistaken perception, about illusions. The skeptics are very worried about illusions. They're worried about imaginations. Aristotle, in the De Anima, writes a lot about various types of mental states: imagination, desires, perceptions, reason, logos, what he calls logos. But phenomenal consciousness is never theorized in these centuries of philosophical work about the mind. And I find that quite stunning. You look at some of the greatest philosophers that have ever existed, and they write very perceptive things about perception, about imagination, about reason. But consciousness as a qualitative field that's supposed to be distinctive of our experiences is never commented upon, is never theorized. By contrast, you move in 17th century after Descartes' work, it becomes a central topic. You look at Locke, you look at Hume, and of course, in the 19th century and 20th century, it becomes a fundamental aspect of the theories about the mind. Okay, so here's, if you're thinking, what if it's so obvious, if it's such an obvious aspect of the mind, how come all these great philosophers for centuries have sort of missed it? So that was, in a sense, that's what got me started. And I think the same point could be made about some non-Western tradition as well, even so I'm much less well-versed there. So I don't want to reveal my ignorance in this respect. But from what I've read, I think similar points could be made about non-Western traditions. That in fact, there's large strands of these non-Western traditions where phenomenal consciousness is not really noticed or theorized upon. And that got me really started thinking. Then I started to really wonder, why is that great philosophers haven't really thought about what some of my colleagues, both in the sciences and philosophy, think is the most crucial aspect of our mental life. And so I did some empirical work. I'm an experimental philosopher, so I do both theoretical work in philosophy and empirical work in the sciences. And I did some work with a former student of mine, Justin Sitzma, who has become an important philosopher on his own since then. And the idea was to try to get a sense of whether lay people, so people without training in philosophy, understand the mind as having phenomenal properties, qualia. It was a very simple set of studies to start with. It was just the first time this kind of work was done. So we started from the ground, from very simple things. And so what we did was we described a simple robot who can do various things, and it can detect information about the world, as many robots can do. They can pick up information about the world. They can pick up information about light. They can see, one might say. They can pick up information about wave sounds. They can hear, one might say. Maybe they can pick up various types of signal. And what we ask the question is whether the robot can see, whether the robot can hear, whether the robot can be angry. For example, you prevent the robot to fulfill its goal. It moves away. It seems to have an angry behavior. Is the robot angry? And then we ask a question about pain. Can the robot feel pain? All right. And what we found is that in contrast to so we asked also both lay people and philosophers, which was a very important part of the project. So philosophers gave the same kind of response for all these mental states. No, the robot cannot see. No, the robot cannot hear. No, the robot cannot be angry. No, the robot cannot feel pain. And our explanation of why philosophers give this kind of response is that there's things that seeing comes with having a feeling of seeing, right? You can't really see, properly speaking, if you don't experience a qualitative experience. It's the same for hearing, the same for feeling emotion. You can't be angry if you don't feel anger. So robot is too simple to feel anger, so it does not feel anger. It's not angry. And the same for feeling pain. By contrast, lay people were totally happy to assign things like seeing, hearing to the robot. Of course, a robot can see. Of course, a robot can hear. And I think that's my intuition as well. When it comes to anger, they were a bit uncertain, right? But they were, ambivalent, one might say. Mm-hmm. When it comes to feeling pain, they actually were very reluctant to assign pain to the robot. And what it tells us is that for lay people who are training in philosophy, there is no unity. There is no such thing as phenomenality that unifies all these mental states. In contrast to philosophers, for whom all these mental states share the same characteristics. They're all phenomenal states. Mm. So one interpretation, I'm not saying it's the only one, we've been criticized a lot, that paper got a lot of attention. But one interpretation, the one we favor, is that for lay people, there is no such thing as phenomenality that's going to unify all these mental states. Seeing just is picking up some kind of information in the world, light information. Hearing is picking up another type of information in the world. There's no phenomenality associated to seeing and hearing. That's why a very simple robot can do it. When it comes to feeling pain, our explanation, and Justin Sitzma's work following our original work has confirmed that there is definitely a grain of truth there, is that it's related to having the right kind of body. If your body is metallic, and not the kind of fleshy thing that has a sensor that is in a way alive, you're not the kind of right things to have pain. So the robot does not have pain because it does not have the right mind. The robot does not have pain because it doesn't have the right body. So what's crucial here is embodiment for feeling pain. So all of that suggests for me a picture of our lay understanding of mental states or the mind, where phenomenal consciousness has no place. Right? On the one hand, you have perceptual state. It's like picking up information, and then you got pain, which is related to having the right kind of body. Right? So that's the type of work I've done in the cognitive sciences.
Sorry, Edward, you froze for a second. What is going on? Edward, can you hear me? I think you froze.
Yes, I can hear you. Yes, I can hear you. Yeah, I can hear you again. We seem to be freezing every...
I'm so sorry. I think the connection's a bit bad. My weather's quite good on my side. I'm not too sure why.
Yeah, that's just not an issue. It does happen when it's not Zoom that's tricking us. It's internet. So I'm more than used to challenges with Wi-Fi. So I was saying that this work with lay people has convinced me, and I think a few other people, that it's not an accident that great philosophers for centuries in the West and elsewhere haven't theorized about consciousness. It's just not part of the way we grasp the real world or mental life. And I think what I want to say, the conclusion I want to draw is that, well, it's because it's not part of our mental life. That's why lay people don't grasp it. It's not an important feature. It's not a feature at all, I should say, of our mental life. So that's the work I've been doing that has convinced me about that.
Edouard, at what point do you think you could convert the layman into thinking that? So do you think it takes one, like maybe telling them the Mary's room experiment, and then suddenly they think that? Well, what do you think?
No, this is an excellent question. And I usually get this kind of pushback, and they say, look, it's true that maybe lay people can't really on their own grasp the phenomenality of their mind, but you can very easily bring them to see that. And there, I'm a little bit less certain. You can lead them to talk the talk, I suppose, but not sure to walk the walk. What do I mean by that? I'm inspired, or this response is driven by what I see in the neurosciences, where some incredibly smart neuroscientists believe that they are addressing the hard problem of consciousness, what Dave Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness, namely providing an explanation of phenomenal consciousness. But really, they're not. They're not even addressing the hard problem of consciousness. They're really talking about what I called earlier access consciousness. And they seem to be confused about the distinction between phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness. And they don't seem to see that providing an explanation of the former, access consciousness, is not providing an explanation of the latter, phenomenal consciousness. And so what it does suggest to me is that the fact that very smart people, very serious scientists, obviously who know their craft, they've thought very hard about how to do science, and they know much of neuroscience, they're still not getting the notion of phenomenal consciousness quite right. Now, that does suggest to me that when lay people come to say things that seems to be in line with what Chalmers would want to say, they're not quite understanding what phenomenal consciousness is, right? So I think we can get lay people to somehow say things that suggest that they grasp the phenomenality of consciousness, or what philosophers think is the phenomenality of consciousness. But I'm a bit skeptical that they are really understanding what Chalmers thinks they should be understanding. And I'm picking up on Chalmers here, mentioning Chalmers not to pick on him, but just to mention as someone who's been very clear in what he thinks phenomenal consciousness is. So that's my response, right? I'm not quite sure we can so easily get people to really understand what Chalmers wants them to understand, rather than just saying the kind of things that are somewhat in line with what Chalmers wants to say.
So another question that arises is, you once wrote a paper, you wrote an article called, double check that, Common Sense is not a good guide to reality.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So should we then take these common sense responses as seriously as you are taking?
This is very good. This is a very good point. So I'm part of my work has been quite critical of the idea that we philosophers should start with commonsensical intuitions and views about the world. And when we theorize about various, both scientific but also metaphysical or philosophical topics, right? So, for example, I don't believe that if you want to do good work about meaning, you should start with lay intuitions about meaning. For example, I've been quite critical of that type of research. The same is true for metaphysics as well. On the other hand, in these other areas, what should you do? Well, you should think about somehow some of the problems that arise. And often these problems might be driven by the sciences. So I think often, one might say I'm a scientific philosopher in some ways. One might think that sciences often give us the right problem to be focusing on. And So these are the places where we should drive the questions we are working on, the various options we are concerned with, and the concepts we are trying to elucidate. And in that respect, starting with common sense is actually, I think, often a dead end. Now, consciousness is interesting. Phenomenal consciousness is interesting because I'm not quite sure that it belongs to the sciences. In fact, I think scientists who work on consciousness are inspired by philosophy. You know, so that's a place where if you dismiss common sense as I do, or if you're quite skeptical of common sense as I do, you might say, you know, someone like, for example, Stan Dehaene, or some people working on consciousness from other scientific traditions, like Akwan Lo, for example, might say that, look, forget about common sense. Maybe it's not part of our common sense understanding of our mental lives, but still there's a science of phenomenal consciousness out there, and you should take that very seriously. After all, you take science very seriously, Edouard. So why don't you take that very seriously? And there, I think much of the science related to phenomenal consciousness is grounded in this philosophy, which I'm very skeptical of. I'm not quite sure there's much reason to work on phenomenal consciousness, except if you've read Dave Chalmers and these philosophers and think there's a really deep puzzle there to be solved. I would not say the same about access consciousness. I would think that there's a really important question about how we are able to pick up information about the world of various types in various modalities and use this information for rational action and rational thinking. And I would say, you know, this is probably one of the most important challenges we have to solve and understand. So that's a problem I would be taking very seriously. It's a problem that I think AI is really making very salient these days, because somehow AI seems to have, recent AI, LLM seems to have solved that problem, maybe. But at least suggests that it might be solvable. By contrast, phenomenal consciousness, if it's not common sense, I'm not quite sure why we should be worried about that problem. And maybe an analogy here might help.
Yes.
So I'm a materialist. I think there's only one substance. I'm not a dualist. I probably even would describe myself as a physicalist. I don't want to get into the type of physicalism I'm embracing. But a century ago, there were some very serious thinkers, some scientists even, who were dualists. And indeed, they asked, even 50 years ago, 17 years ago, John Eccles, I think Eccles, I'm not sure about his first name, you know, who was a very important neuroscientist, was a dualist about the relation between the mind and the brain, or the mind and the body. But I don't think there's much of a motivation to be a dualist 70 years ago, or 100, 200 years ago, the 19th century, except for commonsensical, folksy reasons, folk dualism, or religious reasons, right? So for me, yes, you might find traces of dualism in the 19th century, in the 1970s, 1950s. Of course, much worries about dualism in the sciences in the 19th century. But that's just not a reason for me to be a dualist, because I think the origins of these scientific concerns are common sense, and in the case of phenomenal consciousness, I think the kind of philosophy I'm rejecting, right? So that's the reason why I'm actually I can try to be consistent between my views there.
I'm not sure if the data is still the same, but I remember once reading a paper that showed that even today, if you ask the lay population about their view on consciousness, most of their answers seem to be dualist in nature.
Yeah, so there's this really interesting work in psychology on folk dualism. Paul Bloom has written a bit about that matter, and I think some of it is quite compelling. That there seems to be a tendency to, at the very least, view the mind and the body as obeying different laws or different principles. And I think this is reasonably well established. The slightly stronger claims that lay people tend to view the mind and the body as different substances, what we philosophers would be calling properly dualism, following Descartes' dualistic traditions. That is, I think, a little bit less clear. I think it's more of a reading that Paul Bloom and maybe have imposed. And I'm not quite sure Paul Bloom is really, when Paul Bloom talks about folk dualism, he really means that people are committed to these sophisticated views that there are two substances that somehow must interact or must work in parallel. So I'm not quite sure this is exactly what Bloom means. And I'm less convinced that this is a universal aspect of the mind. It strikes me as very philosophical, and I'm a little bit skeptical that people all over the world would have developed such a sophisticated philosophical views. What is more plausible is that lay people spontaneously develop a view where the body works one way, obeys a specific type of causal principles. The mind works another way, obeys a different types of causal principles. And that we can't really explain the way the mind works by appealing to the principles that explain how the body works, and vice versa. And I think it's also plausible that this commonsensical view has inspired religious traditions, sophisticated, explicit religious traditions that have interpreted this commonsensical dualism, one might say, or explanatory dualism into a substantial dualism, whereas two substances. It's very clear, for example, that the Christian tradition, with which I'm most familiar, is committed to something like a substance dualism. It's also clear that non-Christian, like Plotinus and the Neoplatonist tradition in the ancient Greek philosophy, also were committed to a form of dualism between the mind and the body. And I think a substance dualism, properly substance dualism. And I think where it comes from here is this explanatory dualism that's part of our universal common sense. But notice one small thing here. It's interesting, the contrast here between phenomenal consciousness and folk dualism. So folk dualism is pretty much universal, and it manifests itself in theories in all types of philosophical works. In the ancient time, I mentioned Plato and Plotinus and all the Neoplatonist tradition, right? In modern time, with Christianity and, of course, all the Christian philosophers, and I think in non-Western tradition as well. By contrast, you don't find the same thing for phenomenal consciousness, as I mentioned earlier. So I think there's a really interesting contrast here, where philosophers have picked on something that's very commonsensical, and religious people, theologian, but not so for phenomenal consciousness.
So the mind-body problem in general, very fascinating, and that's what this podcast is about. Mind-body solution, trying to figure out the infamous mind-body problem.
Right.
And that ties in often with free will. You've done some fascinating work on this, and I think you show the cultural differences in how we perceive these problems. Let's start with that. I think that it's a great way to showcase how differently we think from different parts of the planet on the question of free will.
Absolutely, yes. So free will is one of those concepts that might well be universal. I think it's related in the way we view ourselves as agents, right? So we view ourselves as the future is open. I think it's really essential to our self-conception as an agent, that what we do is not predetermined, and rather we are the source of what we do. So I think that, broadly understood in those terms, I think something like free will and having control of our own action is probably a universal concept. That does not mean that very concept is not understood in interestingly different ways, and sometimes in quite different ways across different countries or different cultures. And I think the two are often the case, right? There's some form of universality. It's part of our self-understanding that we are in control of our own actions. The future is open. But there's variation in the way control gets to be understood. And so what we did with some colleagues, it was a very large project that involved many different countries and many different collaborators, all over the world was to examine whether people take into account their environment in the same way. The idea here is that in some culture, the role of the environment is going to be leading you to view yourself as actually having less freedom. So, and I think it comes with a lot of work in psychology that suggests that in some cultures, the self, it's a bit metaphorical, but bear with me, is extended, right? While in other culture, the self is very much inside the individual. So Western cultures, it might be a bit of a caricature, I suspect it is, but there might be a grain of truth there. Western cultures, and as maybe some other parts of the world, tend to conceive of the self as being bound to the individual. And draws a very sharp contrast between the self and their environment, his or her environment. By contrast, in South Asian and East Asian traditions, the self is usually thought to be extended. And so what happened to me depends to some extent on what happens to my environment, including my personal relations. And so that was part of the beginning of the project. And then we thought, well, if that's true, then people should view control in a very different manner, right? So if that's true, if you're a Westerner, and maybe in some of the parts of the world, whether you're in control of your action just depends on what you do, not on your environment. Your environment can change. It has very little impact on whether you have control on your action. By contrast, in some of the East Asian cultures and South Asian culture, but we mostly focus on East Asian culture, China, Japan, and Korea, more precisely, we predicted that change in the environment would actually be reflected in a change in control. So, in some situation, people should feel that the agent has very little control over her action because the environment has changed in some way. Okay, so that was the basic idea, right? Because the self might have a different, in a sense, extent, being very narrow or being extended. Control itself should be conceptualized in different ways, in different cultures. That was the inspiration of the work. And so what we did, we used various cases, but the crucial case was this, what is known as the Frankfurt case. And the Frankfurt case has this very weird story. It's a very weird background story where an agent wants to do some. So imagine a situation where an agent has to make a choice. So, for example, an agent has to vote between, let's say, Trump and Biden in 2020 as the last election. And then there's another agent who is a neuroscientist, let's say. And this neuroscientist has tempered a little bit with the brain of the first agent, such that if the first agent on his own or on her own vote for Biden, nothing happens. However, if the agent intends to vote for Trump, then there's a switch in the brain such that the agent ends up voting for Biden. So in any case, the agent will vote for Biden, right? In 2020, our agent goes to the poll on November 7, and on her own, vote for Biden. So nothing happened, the tempering of the brain, the chip that was put in the brain does not intervene. And at the end of the day, the agent votes, so to speak, on her own for Biden. It's an interesting case for a philosopher working on free will, because the agent could not have done otherwise. At least it seems on some readings that the agent could not have done otherwise. If on her own she was going to vote for Biden, she would have voted for Biden. If she intended to vote for Trump, she still would have voted for Biden. So she could not have done otherwise. And but on the other hand, the agent seems to express when she votes for Biden, her own commitment, right? She really means to vote for Biden, and she does vote for Biden. So that's a contrast where the agent's own commitment is expressed by her action. She meant to vote for Biden, she votes for Biden, but she does not have this counterfactual possibility of having acted otherwise. So there's a two seems to be in tension in that interesting structure. And what we found when we gave that case to many people all over the world is that most people in the world seem to say that the agent is free, in control of her action, and responsible. And particularly in the US, that's what they say, in the Western world. And that makes a lot of sense. If you think control depends on who you are, and you have this very narrow individuality. Makes a lot of sense because you express your preferences, your commitment. You're committed for Biden, she's committed for Biden, she votes for Biden. Makes total sense. So she's free and she's in control. However, when we look at what happened in Asia, it's mostly in Korea, Japan, and China, but also I believe in Indonesia. I haven't reread the paper recently, and I don't quite remember about India, but I think India is along the line of China and Korea. But don't, it's just my memory at this point. I don't have the paper right in front of me. What we found, at least in East Asia, is that people are much less likely to say that the agent is free and in control. So in that, and I think the explanation is the one we gave earlier. You and your control is just not a matter of what's inside you. You might be committed, but your broader environment matters for understanding control and for understanding the expression of the self. So the extension of the self, the fact that the self is in a sense extended in this culture, I think has an impact on the way they think of control and free will. So that's really it was a totally unexpected but sort of predicted result. I think that's a really striking finding that people might conceptualize control and free will in very different ways, perhaps because they understand the self in very different ways.
Yeah, I think it's very fascinating because this whole concept of trying to understand free will and its impact on moral responsibility, I mean, these two are fundamentally intertwined. I mean, how do we even separate?
I couldn't agree more.
At this point, from all the research you've done, where do you stand on free will? Do you think it's compatible with determinism? Do you think it's incompatible? Do you have a stance in terms of giving a philosophical view?
I tend to be, I don't work really on the metaphysics of free will. So I haven't given nearly as much thought as I should have. My inclination is a little bit of a deflationary one. I do believe that the notion of free will is quite ambiguous. And I do believe that the debate between let's say the compatibilist and non-compatibilist, anti-compatibilist, is to a large extent a verbal debate. So it's not a substantial debate. I think there's a very clear sense in which free will is compatible with determinism. And there's also a very clear sense in which free will is not compatible with determinism. And I do think there's not much more to be said than that, because I think the word free will, or the ideas around control and free will are in fact polysemous. There's not one notion of free will. There's in fact many notions of free will, and people are often moving back and forth in somewhat, let people in a confused manner between these notions. So you can't really sort out what is the meaning of the expression free will, such that you can get a univocal answer to the question, is free will compatible with determinism? So that's a little bit, in some ways, a deflationary attitude towards the whole literature on free will and determinism. It's a little bit of a disappointing conclusion in some ways, because you're not taking a fighting stand with respect to one of the debate. But I do think there's really a lot of reason to endorse that view. And I think that, when you look a little bit about how people use notions such as control, responsibility, free will, you can really see a great polysemy in the ways this notion happened to be used. And so I've always found the metaphysical debate a little bit, and I apologize to my dear colleagues, underwhelming, and I've never felt a great motivation to engage in it, because it always seems to me that people are talking across each other, past one another, in that debate. I'm not the only one to say that, of course. Dave Chalmers, in a beautiful paper called, I think, Verbal Disputes, published nearly 10 years ago, has really also expressed a very similar type of view. And independently of him, but I've been very also convinced by the way he frames that a position about the free will debate.
I mean, what you spoke about earlier, what I'd like to unpack that a bit more, because I find this whole concept of personal identity very fascinating. I mean, we've got the East and the West both seeing themselves in a very different way. Excuse me, sorry about that. And how do you perceive personal identity at this point? Do you think, because often someone can make the case, you're, let's say, 30 trillion human cells, 39 trillion bacterial cells. Are you bacteria? Are you human? I mean, how do we conceive of this idea of who the self is?
I totally agree. So I think there's the question of identity has become increasingly more puzzling in recent decades, both for metaphysical reasons. I think, Parfit's work in 1984 in his famous book has really raised so many puzzles about what it means to be the same person across times and across possibilities. But there's also, that you alluded to right now, the recent discoveries about, what lives in me, and the fact that a large part of me is things that in some ways are not me, or are they, or aren't they? And I think it has raised a lot of, deep metaphysical puzzles about what it means to be oneself, what it means to be a single organism, and what it means to remain the same across time, both psychologically and also just physiologically. And in fact, I think, so here's one thing I'm sometimes tempted to say, is that our notion of oneness and identity are hard to reconcile with the complexity of the world we're dealing with. So we have this understanding of ourselves as a one person, as a unit. Now there is a variation, as I mentioned, across culture about what that means to be one. And I think some cultures maybe put less emphasis on unity. From my understanding, Indian philosophical traditions have put less emphasis on the unity, or understand it in different ways. But again, I'm not an expert there. But still, I think it's often at least there's something there that we are one agent. And that's part, again, of a commonsensical understanding of the world. It's an important lay concept. But I think this lay concept is not quite up to the task to make sense of both our psychology, where I think the idea that we are one is wrong. We're not one. The mind is not one. The mind is many in many ways, and many different things at the same time. And the body is not one. And in fact, the puzzle here come when we import this commonsensical notion of identity, and we try to fit the reality to them, or to tailor them to the reality. And I think this is a losing proposition. I think the right thing is that we're just not one. We are many. And I think the idea to try to build identity both at a physiological level and at a psychological level is very difficult it's very unlikely to succeed. And I think a much more interesting view, rather than try to either change the concept of identity or change the concept of oneness or self-permanence, is actually embrace the plurality and say, actually, I'm not one, I'm many. What does that exactly mean? And I think the same is true both for biology and for... Just an interesting question about what it means to be an organism. How do you distinguish? There's still a unity in organism. There's processes that maintain a boundary between myself and the other, processes that allows me to, in some ways, remain, be continuous across time. So there's still a lot of interesting things to say, even if you recognize that commonsensical notion of identity are just not up to the task.
Yes, often I prefer saying like I am a process. Yeah, rather than a specific.
That's right. So John Dupré, who you might know, is a philosopher of biology at the University of Exeter, has put a lot of emphasis on the idea of process, and I do think it's much more compatible. You know, processes, of course, have a form of unity, right? It's the same process in some way, but a form of unity that's quite different from our layer understanding of things.
Yes. Tell me, Edouard, from your work, I mean, from when you think about the cultural differences from the East and the West, moral responsibility, how do you think these views on free will do impact moral responsibility and implications moving forward? So if I know you spoke about the trolley experiment, there's a lot of work that you've spoken about in general. Do you want to touch on some of those aspects of how we apply this to moral responsibility?
Yes, there's of course a deep connection, at least an intuitively deep connection between moral responsibility and being a free agent. Excuses often are given to people. We excuse people's actions when we realize they were, in some sense, compelled to act one way or the other. So there's obviously some kind of connection here between notions such as control, by contrast, notion being compelled to do something, and being held responsible for what has done. I think it's a fascinating question about how variation in understanding about control impacts our understanding of responsibility. Now, it's a tricky question because it's obviously not the case that it's a necessary condition for people to be responsible for something that they even have done it. Right, one might think there's such a thing as collective responsibility. You might inherit responsibility for things you haven't done. It's often, for example, discussed in the context of genocides. For example, the Shoah, the murders of the Jews in Europe in the 1940s, particularly in Germany. There's been a lot of discussion about whether or not there's collective responsibilities that might be inherited across generations. But of course, modern Germans haven't done anything. They didn't cause the murders that their parents or grandparents might have done. Same thing for French who collaborated with the German, right? I don't think my ancestors did anything, but supposing they did, I didn't do anything. But one might think there's a form of responsibility that's inherited. So what it does suggest here is that the notion of responsibility, while it is connected to notion of control, that's a case of how do we get excused for what we've done? Well, sometimes I'm compelled to do something by external circumstances, so I'm not responsible for what I do. Its relation with control is actually quite complicated. Right? Because I clearly did not have any control with what my grandfather did, and nor did modern Germans with what their grandfather did. But they might have, in a sense, responsibility. So what it does suggest here again is that, as is often the case, so when we take a folk notion, the one of responsibility, there's a lot of flexibility here in the way it relates to other notions, which is in many ways a very good thing if you're a philosopher. Right? If as soon as you understand that lay notions, they have a form of they're quite malleable and they're quite used in many different ways depending on various circumstances. It's a resource for a philosopher because then you might want to recast the notion of responsibility in a way that may be less connected to not necessarily control, but to some form of control, to metaphysical notion of control, or maybe to very individualistic notion of control. So you might have broader notion of responsibility that allow for forms of control that are not really, or less control or no control at all. So that's in a sense where I'm inclined, which is because lay concepts have this flexibility. We philosophers should take advantage of that, to retool them, to redefine them, to engineer new concept of responsibility. That's the way I tend to think about my not necessarily empirical work in this area, but my more normative take about what we philosophers should be doing when it comes to responsibility.
Have you read the new book by Robert Sapolsky, Determined?
No, I haven't yet read it yet. It has just come my way. I will definitively have a look at it.
But before reading it, do you think that you're going to sort of agree with this view, or?
I'm almost, from what I've read, I'm almost certain I will disagree with the view. It seems to be doing, I think, what many scientists have done, which is being very impressed by the causal network in which we're embedded, and which is undeniable because we are embedded in a complex causal network. And I think a bit too quickly jumping to denying free will. As I said, I'm not a compatibilist or I'm a compatibilist of a sort, because I believe it's at the end of the day a verbal dispute. But I do my quick understanding from the quotes I've read, from the reviews I've read, and again, it's secondhand, so bear with me. But I think he is underestimating the sophistication that compatibilists have put forward to understand how freedom is compatible with determinism. And I think, a very classical position, the one which I've always found probably one of the most interesting one, is thinking of a free action as one that expresses the deep commitments of an agent. Right? So being free. So which of our actions are free? Well, the one that expresses who we are at that time. That's why in the Frankfurt case, one might say, well, the agent acts freely in that circumstances because her action reflects who she is. She wants to vote for Biden. She's a Democrat. She does not want Trump to be elected. And that's a free action. And that view is remarkably compatible with determinism, right? Who I am is, of course, caused by my environment. I'm part of a nexus of causes that has made who the individual I am. But there's still someone I am.
Yes.
And some of my actions express who I am, others don't. So you take my hand and you compel me to hold that pen or to let that pen fall. Well, that action does not express who I am. You just compelled me. So it's not a free action. But notice on this view, determinism is a little bit of a red herring for thinking about free will. What matters is your values, your commitments. That's really the kind of thing that seems to be important. So I think this is a type of view that that one might think anyway are very attractive and are compatible with determinism, entirely compatible with determinism. And I think the kind of resources like that someone like Sapolsky just seems to be just not really giving their due. It doesn't seem to be taking them sufficiently into account. But I haven't read the book. Maybe he does. Maybe he has extremely powerful objections. So I do plan to read the book in the future.
At this point, Edouard, in terms of your views on consciousness, I know you're a materialist at heart. Does your materialism seem to align along with those like Dennett, Frankish, or does it go along more like the lines of Philip Goff? Is it more of a panpsychist view? Where do you
I'm definitely not a panpsychist. I'm definitely not a panpsychist. I think panpsychism wants to explain mystery by more mystery, and I've always found that not quite the way to provide good explanations. Postulating mysterious things is not the way to provide an explanation. In fact, it's actually the opposite of providing a good explanation. Good explanation have those features that we explain the mysterious by things that are less mysterious. So we need to posit things we understand to increase our understanding of what needs to be explained. So that's a fundamental, essential characteristic of a good explanation. Panpsychists violate this requirement on explanation. They postulate mysterious things in order to explain things that take to be mysterious. And this is just not the way good explanations work. So I'm definitively not a panpsychist. I've grown very fond of Dan Dennett over the years. Surprisingly, I started by being quite skeptical of Dennett's philosophical positions. While he's a materialist, I've always found when I was younger, one might say when I was younger, his views about the mind unsatisfying, vague. He has his views that mental states are ascribed, they're part of a stance. We take a stance when we assign mental states. And I've never quite understood what that really means. And I've always found that as a very deflationary understanding of the nature of the status of the mental, of the ontology of the mental. So I've always been more, at least in the past, more attracted to views that take to be mental states to be real and to be identical to physical states, either as types or as token, right? So if you're a non-reductionist physicalist. So that was my views for a very long time, the type of views that Jerry Fodor, for example, has developed. In recent years, however, and mostly because I find it very hard to bring my understanding of neuroscience with my understanding of psychology, and I find the two don't really mesh that well. And I've always found attempts at, okay, here are a set of mental states I use to explain behavior, either in lay explanation or scientific explanation in cognitive science. And then people looking at the brain and trying to look where in the brain those could be, trying to fit them in the brain. I find this project has not been very successful over the last 20 years. I think it's very hard to just really identify any mental state in the brain, or in the brain and the body if you're an embodied type of person. And I've become much more sensitive. Maybe that Dennett got something right. So maybe it's a mistake to try to say, oh, look, here's a belief, or here is a scientific mental state that cognitive scientists postulate to explain behavior. And here's a brain state, and the two are identical. That's, in a sense, what I was hoping that we would, at this point, that we would be there. But we're not there at all. Not at all. It might be that the relation between the mind, mental states, psychological explanation, and the brain, neural explanation, is not of that kind. It's actually of a different type. And maybe Dan Dennett's views that mental states are more part of a stance that gets to be assigned. And neurosciences are of different stance. And the two they should not be understood in terms of identification. But in fact, we should have another way of thinking about the relation between mental states and brain state. I've grown very attracted to that view in recent years. Surprisingly, perhaps, it's because of my greater acquaintance with philosophy of physics, where in philosophy of physics, at least many people, and some of my favorite colleagues, don't have the view that we should identify physical states at a higher level with physical state at a lower level. There's no real, very simple match.
Yes.
Yeah. It's much more complex relation. And I think the same might well be true about the mind and the brain. So it's my next book might actually be about exactly that topic. So I'm thinking I need to write a book on this very complicated question, and because I'm rethinking some of my former commitments about the relation between the mind and the brain, and going back to Dennett a little bit, trying to understand what he might have had in mind and trying to elaborate on some of his views.
You must check out some of the work also done by Nicholas Humphrey. Sentience is his latest book. I think that's also...
Okay,
I'll
check that out.
Yeah, it's another great way because he follows along the same lines as Dennett, except he calls it phenomenal surrealism.
Okay.
Even though it's something that we're sort of inventing, it is still considered to be more real than real. Our experience of red is actually more real than red within itself. But it's a view that you should actually read and see for yourself.
I will definitely check it out. I mean, I know of the book. I just haven't had time to read it just yet. I will definitely check it out.
Edouard, at this point in your career, what aspects of philosophy of science, cognitive science, physics intrigues you the most, and where's your head at this point?
So I'm finishing a book right now, and I've been really so I've been working on it for 7 years, and it's a book about when science goes wrong. It's a book about scientific failure, and I've been really excited by that, mostly because, of course, we've learned a lot in the last 15 years about scientific failures with the replication crisis, in psychology, in other fields like the biomedical sciences. Also with the discovery that fraud in science is actually not that rare. It's rare, but not that rare. And I think as soon as you start reading a bit of a history of science, and I'm a historian and philosopher of science, you do realize that failure is extremely common in science. It's actually the rule of the game. Science fails much more often than it succeeds.
Yes.
And for me, it has raised a lot of questions about how science works and about our relation to science, about whether we should trust science. If we should not trust science, what should be our relation to science? How can science be successful if it fails more often than not? Is it just a matter of luck? What kind of luck? So that's a kind of concern that have been really keeping me up at night for now a few years. When I was younger again, I was very much trusting science. I was a science booster. I had a fairly naive understanding of how science works, and I thought that I related science a bit like as an oracle. Science says P. And in recent years, I've actually lost entirely this attitude. Now I've become quite skeptical of science. Not skeptical of science as a whole, as a very successful epistemic enterprise. I do believe science works, and there's nothing like science when we want to learn about the world and act in the world. But everyday science, I think we should take it with a lot of salt, with a grain of salt. In fact, more than a grain of salt. And that has the kind of concern, reassessing my own understanding of the process of science and the very difficult modeling through mistakes, through failed attempts, through dead ends that science really amounts to. And that my next book is about all this kind of question. So that's something I've been really excited by in philosophy of science.
It's funny how a philosopher who's trying to critique science often has to backtrack and make sure that they let the people know that they still love science. And
I absolutely
misinterpret it so quickly.
You are absolutely right. I can't talk about these matters without letting people know that I'm not a science skeptic of a specific type. I do believe that science has been the most incredible epistemic enterprise, but you're quite right. If I don't say that, people look at me in a very weird manner. So I want to make it clear.
Yeah, I know that feeling, because when I started this podcast, I mean, I'm very much pro science. I love everything about it. But when I critique it or talk about it from a philosophical perspective, I see the comments I get, and it's really not justified, because a lot of people then assume you're very much anti-science once you make one critique, which is not correct.
It's actually wrong. It's actually wrong, because in fact, often we criticize science because we love them, because we are acquainted with it, because we want to understand it better, because we think that's also the way a healthy science works. Exactly. So in fact, my view is that skepticism is one of the most important scientific virtues. And I think it should be brought forward more, that we should not be afraid of being skeptical of what much of science tells us, because this is a proper scientific attitude. So anyway, so I totally, I'm with you on this one.
A lot of people don't seem to realize the normativity we apply to our scientific experience. I mean, every scientist has a normative value they're applying to this search. So no matter what they're researching, there's something in the back of their head that is trying to prove or disprove a bias of their own. And we often need to remember that at the end of the day. Thank you, Edouard. This has been such an amazing conversation. Anything from your side? Any final words?
No, I just wanted to thank you. I've really been enjoying also this discussion. It's been really covering a lot of ground, and it's been really, really, really enjoyable. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Edouard. And if ever we have a round two, I think something that I often enjoy and the listeners really like is we take a paper of yours and we dissect it in depth, and I run it through with the audience. People really seem to love it.
I would love that. So feel free to reach out again, and we can schedule another meeting.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Edouard. Have a great day.
All right. Thank you very, very much. I was very sincere. Actually, I really enjoyed the discussion. I think it went it went very well. So yeah, it was a real pleasure. Thanks again.